Part 1. The Fortress of Ice. The hostile environment of the castle. The popular imagination often paints the medieval castle as a romantic setting, a place of grand stone halls, flickering torches, and noble fortitude. Yet the reality of living within one during the deep grip of winter was a brutal test of endurance. To step into a medieval castle at night was to step into a vast, echoing refrigerator. The very architecture, designed so brilliantly for defense against human enemies, served as a conduit for a far more insidious foe, the relentless cold. The massive stone walls, sometimes 12 feet thick, were masters of thermal inertia. They did not just resist warmth, they actively swallowed it. In winter, these stones held the freezing temperatures like a memory, radiating a damp, profound chill that penetrated the thickest clothing. Walking across the flagstone floors, polished smooth by centuries of footsteps, one felt the cold biting upward through the soles of boots. The air inside these great keeps was heavy, damp, and unwelcoming. Architects of the era prioritized moats, drawbridges, and arrow slits. Insulation was simply not on their blueprints. Furthermore, many castles in northern Europe were strategically situated on wind-swept hills for military advantage. This brilliance in defense was a curse for comfort, as high winds scoured the exterior surfaces and forced icy drafts through every conceivable gap in shutters and beneath heavy wooden doors. The evening began with a deceptive bastion of warmth, the Great Hall. This was the beating heart of the castle, alive with the noise of diners, dogs scavenging scraps, and the smell of roasted meat and wood smoke. Dominated by a massive open hearth where entire tree trunks might be burned, the Great Hall was the only space where heating was remotely successful. Yet even here, comfort was a localized illusion. The roaring fire created a defiant square of orange heat, but its reach was limited. A few feet from the blaze, the air turned frigid again. Heat rose uselessly into the high, smoke-stained rafters, leaving those on the floor to huddle together in cloaks. Feasts were sometimes scheduled in the bitterest months as strategic heating sessions, relying on the combined body heat of hundreds of guests to make the cavernous space tolerable. But this glow was fleeting. As the feast wound down and the fire was allowed to burn low into embers, the hall quickly succumbed to the encroaching cold. The transition from this temporary warmth to the bedchamber was a dreaded nightly ritual. Leaving the hearth meant stepping into narrow, drafty corridors, lit perhaps by a single guttering torch. The cold air rushed through unsealed doorways like a physical blow, instantly draining whatever warmth one had gathered. Breath fogged in the freezing air, and the silence of the settling castle became oppressive. The walk itself was often described by travelers as a shock to the system, a shivering ordeal that served as a grim reminder that the night would be long, merciless, and a constant battle for thermal survival. Part 2. The Architecture of Sleep. Beds and bedding as survival tools. Once the terrifying transition from the Great Hall was complete, the medieval sleeper faced their bedchamber, a tomb of stone and drafts. In such a hostile environment, the bed itself had to be engineered as a microclimate, a fortress of fabric built within the fortress of stone. Survival depended on constructing layers of defense against the ambient temperature of the room, which often hovered just about freezing. The centerpiece of this defense for the wealthy was the great four-poster bed. These were not merely impressive pieces of carpentry meant to display status, they were machines for living. Raised high off the damp, freezing floor, the bed frame itself was the first step in escaping the coldest layer of air that settled near the ground. However, the true genius lay in the canopy and the heavy curtains that draped down from it. Drawing these thick tapestries closed turned the bed into a tent within the room, trapping body heat and creating a small, livable pocket of air. While the room outside the curtains remained frigid, the temperature inside could rise just enough to make sleep possible. These curtains also blocked the relentless drafts that sliced through arrow slits and poorly sealed windows, and they offered a psychological sense of enclosure and safety. Inside this fabric cocoon, the battle continued with bedding. The foundation determined one's social standing and comfort level. For the nobility, the prize was the feather bed, a massive sack stuffed with goose or duck down that cradled the body and provided immense insulation. These were treasured possessions, often moved from castle to castle with the household. The alternative, for the vast majority of people, including lower-ranking castle inhabitants, was the straw tick, a coarse sack filled with straw, hay, or reeds. While better than the bare floor, straw mattresses were lumpy, compressed quickly, smelled musty, and frequently harbored fleas and vermin, requiring regular beating and refilling. Regardless of the mattress, the strategy above it was the same: extreme layering. A linen sheet might lie against the skin, but over it were piled heavy woolen blankets, sometimes so weighty they felt like a hound pressing down on the sleeper. For the truly wealthy, fur was essential. Coverlets lined with Arctic fox, marten, or sheepskin provided dense, incomparable warmth. Some nobles were so paranoid about the cold they refused to travel without their fur-lined bedding, even in summer. The goal was to be swaddled so tightly that movement was difficult, sacrificing mobility for the sake of retaining every fraction of body heat. The floor of the chamber also played a role. It was typically strewn with rushes, dried plants gathered from fields or marshes. These acted as a crude form of carpet, offering a slight padding against the freezing flagstones and absorbing the constant dampness that dripped from the walls. While they might smell sweet like meadow grass when fresh, they quickly turned foul with food scraps, spills, and animal waste, becoming a haven for pests. Yet they were a necessary layer between the human foot and the unforgiving stone, another small, imperfect weapon in the nightly arsenal against the winter chill. Part 3. The warmth of others: clothing, community, and co-sleeping. Even with the most elaborate canopy bed and piles of furs, a solitary body in a freezing stone chamber fought a losing battle. Heat bled away into the void. Therefore, one of the most effective medieval survival strategies was simple: shared warmth. Sleep was rarely a private, solitary act. It was a communal effort to turn bodies into radiators pressed together in the dark. Before entering the bed, personal attire was the final layer of defense. Unlike modern habits of light sleepwear, medieval people went to bed heavily bundled. The staple was the nightshirt, a long linen tunic, over which might be worn a woolen tunic for extra insulation. Crucially, almost everyone wore a nightcap or coif. It was common knowledge that heat escaped rapidly through the head, so a sleeper without a cap was considered dangerously exposed. These close-fitting cloth caps tied under the chin were essential armor against the night air, muffling sound and keeping the skull warm. Once dressed, the best way to multiply heat was to share the bed. Among the nobility, servants might sleep on pallets at the foot of the master's bed, or trusted companions might share the bed itself. The added body heat in the enclosed space raised the temperature significantly. This practice was even more common among the lower classes and in communal living situations. Monasteries and military barracks provided prime examples of communal endurance. Monks slept in vast, drafty dormitories, their small cots arranged in long rows side by side. While this offered no privacy, the sheer mass of bodies breathing and emitting heat created a collective warmth that made the large hall bearable. Soldiers in barracks similarly huddled together on straw, wrapped in cloaks, finding safety from the frost in proximity. In peasant cottages, entire families, parents, children, and grandparents piled into a single bed, a tangle of limbs beneath a heap of blankets, valuing survival over dignity. Animals were also crucial participants in this thermal economy. The phrase, "a three-dog night," has roots in the reality of using dogs as living heaters. Their high body temperatures and thick fur made them excellent bed companions. A couple of large hounds curled at one's feet could mean the difference between numb toes and a tolerable night. This practice was widespread, with lapdogs pampered by noble women for warmth and larger breeds serving as foot warmers. In rural areas and inns, travelers sometimes preferred sleeping in stables with horses and cattle, as the immense heat generated by the large livestock was far superior to a freezing guest room. The smell was intense, but warmth always trumped fragrance. Part 4. Fire, Smoke, and Bedtime Rituals of Warmth. While body heat and textiles were passive defenses, medieval people also employed active measures to fight the cold before sleep claimed them. The most obvious was fire, but the reality of medieval heating was far from the cozy ideal. Fireplaces in castle bedchambers were enormous, yet impressively inefficient. Their vast chimneys allowed most of the heat to escape directly upward along with the smoke. A roaring blaze might scorch one's face and shins if standing directly before it, but a mere 10 feet away, the air remained bitterly cold. Furthermore, these fires were dirty. Without modern flues, smoke frequently billowed back into the room, stinging eyes, blackening walls with soot, and coating lungs with ash. To be warm near the fire was often to breathe smoke. It was a miserable trade-off that people accepted as necessary for survival. Because the fire's reach was so limited, the bed itself needed preheating. Entering ice-cold sheets was a dreaded experience that could leave a person shivering for an hour. The solution was the warming pan, a brass or copper pan filled with hot coals from the fire attached to a long handle. A servant would slide this pan back and forth between the bed sheets just before the occupant retired. It left behind a wonderful, fleeting warmth and a faint smell of wood smoke and singed linen. Hazards were common. Sheets were frequently scorched, and sometimes beds stuffed with straw were set ablaze by stray sparks. Other methods included wrapping heated stones or bags of hot sand in cloth and placing them at the foot of the bed as primitive hot water bottles. Diet also played a crucial role in preparing the body for the night. Supper in winter consisted of heavy, hearty pottages, thick stews of grain, vegetables, and meat that sat heavily in the stomach, providing long-lasting fuel for the body's internal furnace. Before bed, warm, calorie-rich drinks were consumed to spread heat internally. Spiced wine, hippocras, heated ale, or hot mead were favorites, sometimes supposedly taken for medicinal reasons to balance the body's humors against the cold. The warmth of the drink, combined with the alcohol, helped lull the body into drowsiness. Occasionally, the wealthy indulged in a hot bath before bed, a massive logistical undertaking involving heating gallons of water over fires. Stepping from a steaming tub into a pre-warmed bed was the ultimate luxury, a rare victory over winter. Yet even these rituals provided only temporary relief. The warming pan's heat faded, the drink cooled, and the fire eventually died down to embers, requiring someone, usually a servant, or in peasant homes, a family member, to wake in the dead of night to stoke it, a shivering duty essential to keep the room from becoming unbearable before dawn. Part 5. The Psychology of Survival and the Paradox of Comfort. Surviving a medieval winter night was as much a psychological battle as a physical one. The cold was a relentless, invisible enemy that besieged the castle every single night. It shaped behaviors, beliefs, and the very definition of comfort. The severity of the cold inside these stone structures could be shocking. Historical records mention frost blooming on the inside walls of bedchambers, glistening by candlelight. Travelers wrote of waking with icicles hanging from their bed curtains or discovering the water in their wash basin frozen solid into a block of ice. This intrusion of winter into the supposed sanctuary of the home was a constant demoralizing reminder of nature's power. To cope with this vulnerability, medieval people turned to faith and superstition. The night air itself was considered dangerous, capable of upsetting the body's humors and causing illness. Therefore, sleep was surrounded by protective rituals. Amulets and crosses were hung above beds. Pouches of strong-smelling herbs like juniper or rue were placed nearby to ward off sickness and evil spirits thought to lurk in the cold darkness. Prayers were whispered not just for piety, but as a shield against the perils of the night. The fear of death by freezing was real, reinforced by grim tales of guards found frozen at their posts or travelers dying in their sleep on mountain passes. Interestingly, a great paradox existed in the hierarchy of warmth. While nobles had grand beds, furs, and massive fireplaces, their cavernous rooms were almost impossible to heat effectively. They might shiver in splendor, surrounded by luxury that offered little real comfort. In contrast, peasants in their humble wattle and daub cottages often fared better. Their small, low-ceilinged homes were easier to heat with a single central hearth. A thatched roof provided better insulation than stone, and the crowded presence of the entire family and sometimes their livestock created a dense, effective communal warmth. The poorest hut could sometimes be cozier than the Lord's keep. Ultimately, medieval sleepers were survivalists. They did not expect the effortless, climate-controlled rest we enjoy today. Sleep was a nightly challenge intended to be engineered with rituals, tools, and endurance. It was a dynamic state, interrupted by the need to tend fires or the discomfort of the cold. Every morning they woke up was a small victory. Their experience reminds us that human ingenuity is often born of desperate necessity, and that comfort is a relative fragile thing, fought for layer by layer against the encroaching ice.